Verses 1 and 2, the Bible says this. It says, "Where do wars and fightings come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask." When we look back at the course of history, we can see what the lust of power, that lust for power, that lust for prestige and for possessions has resulted in over the many years of history. It has cast a dark cloud over the course of human history, beginning all the way back in Genesis 4 with the story of Cain and Abel. Well, Daniel chapter 11 is going to give us a whole lot more of the same. As I've mentioned before, Daniel chapters 10 through 12 all go together to form one unit, and they serve to give us one of the most remarkable prophecies found in the whole Bible. There are some scholars, and I will call them liberal scholars, there are some who believe that because of the content that we find in chapter 11, that this is a chapter that can't be preached and shouldn't be preached. Can you imagine that? There are people who actually fall on the side that say, you can't preach Daniel chapter 11, you shouldn't even try it. Just leave it alone. So if you're going to preach a series through Daniel, just skip it. However, if we believe that all Scripture is divinely inspired, including chapter 11, then that means it is all worthy not only of study, but also of preaching, right? Okay. On the other hand, there are other liberal theologians who, because of the detailed and accurate description of history, that there are more and more liberal scholars that have seized upon chapter 11 as proof that they say the book of Daniel must have been written in the 2nd century BC. Because it is not, what they would say is it is impossible for any prophecy to be as accurate as chapter 11 is. Therefore, because it's so accurate, it must have been written after the fact as prophecy when it wasn't. Because they are of the mindset that God does not do prophecy. They say there is no such thing as prophecy. So when they come to chapter 11, it's just the detail of it. They say it's impossible. So they claim it had to have been written after the events described. To these people, I would say that what you believe about God matters a great deal, and that's why we did our We Believe series. If the God of the Bible is omniscient, meaning that he knows all things, he knows past, present, and future, then that means God, who is omniscient, is perfectly capable of giving a highly detailed prophecy hundreds of years before it ever takes place. So, for me, I have no doubts that this chapter is a legitimate prophecy of future events at the time. God inspired it, the angel revealed it, Daniel wrote it, we get to read it and then interpret it. It's a wonderful thing. And tonight, we are going to focus in on chapter 11, and we're going to really just focus on verses 1 through 20. Next week, we're going to come back. We're not going to finish chapter 11 next week. Next week, we're going to come back and look at verses 21 through about verse 35. And then 2 weeks from now, we have our business meeting. We'll be looking at verses 36 through the end of the chapter. But tonight, we're going to focus on the first 20 verses, which examine 4 kingdoms. They examine the Medo-Persia kingdom, the Grecian kingdom, Egypt, and Syria. It's also important for us to remember as we look at Daniel chapter 11 that Daniel was always focused on the nation of Israel. We have emphasized that and we've seen that throughout the whole book, that Daniel was constantly focused on the future of Israel and what was to come and how everything impacted Israel and what would become of her as a nation. We saw descriptions of 4 great empires already in relation to Israel, given in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, where we saw representations of the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, and the Roman Empire. In Daniel chapter 8, that vision focused narrowly down to Medo-Persia and Greece. Well, those same two empires are the subject at the beginning of Daniel chapter 11. Only this time, instead of a whole chapter, these two kingdoms are going to get all of 4 verses dedicated to them, and that's it. So, as we go into it, let's go ahead and we're going to get into the first of these, which is the Medo-Persia and Grecian kingdoms. Let's look at these first two. And you're going to notice as you look at your sheet tonight, I don't have a lot of bullet points to give you. So we're going to just kind of walk through these verses. I'm going to give you a couple of main points under each kingdom for you to just have a takeaway from. And then what I want to do, after we walk through these verses and see what takes place in them and see the historical accuracy of what happened with what God predicted, as we do that at the end, I then want to ask 3 questions that will help us with being able to say, well, why does this passage matter to me? What is the impact in my life? What does it matter for me as I read this passage? Why is it important to be taught and to be preached? All right, and so that is where we will go tonight. So let's go ahead and begin with Medo-Persia and Greece, where the first thing we're going to see is that God supports and protects as he chooses. God supports and protects as he chooses. Daniel chapter 11, look with me at verses 1 and 2. Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Remember, this is the angel from chapter 10 still speaking to Daniel. In verse 2, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. All right. Now, in many ways, verse 1 belongs with chapter 10. Verse 1 serves as a hinge verse that connects chapter 10 with chapter 11. The angel of chapter 10 informs Daniel that he had come to confirm and strengthen Darius the Mede, that is King Cyrus, in the first year of his reign after conquering Babylon. So the angel reveals, listen, he showed up 2 years before this vision ever happened. Why is that important? Why does it matter that this angel showed up in the first year of King Cyrus's reign over Babylon? It's because that is the same year that Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Israel. The implication is that this angel was perhaps used by God to strengthen Darius to issue the decree. But then we come to verse 2, where for us, the history lesson begins. But for Daniel, it was just the beginning of a long, detailed prophecy. Following Darius, verse 2 tells us that 3 more kings will arise in Persia. History tells us who these next 3 kings were. There were Cambyses from 530 to 522 BC, Pseudo-Smyrtus in 522 BC, and Darius first Histopes, I don't even know how to pronounce it. Darius the first Histopes in 522 to 486 BC. It then says, following those 3 kings, a 4th king would arise, and this king would be far richer than them all, far richer than all the ones who came before him. This king is also going to provoke Greece, and they are going to set the stage for the rise of the Greek Empire. This king's name is the king we know as Xerxes, who reigned from 486 to 465 BC. This is the same Xerxes who in the book of Esther flaunted his great wealth. You remember the book of Esther where he throws that grand party and he wants to bring his wife out and parade her around in front of everybody like she's some kind of trophy, and she refuses. Remember that? Yeah, he was displaying his wealth and how great he was. And then she rejected him, and we see everything that happened there in the book. But we also know from history that Xerxes, after that, then used his wealth to raise a mighty army. And his purpose for raising this army was to invade the Grecian areas. He ultimately wanted to conquer all of Greece, but he was defeated in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. And so he had gone on this tirade, this mission to overtake and destroy Greece, and he failed miserably. He had some success, but he failed, and his wealth could not buy him the victory. And suddenly, with that being said, with the angel telling Daniel about this fourth king, suddenly the angel is finished with Persia. There's no more talk of any more kings that would follow. You know why? Because none of the kings after Xerxes matter. Xerxes is the one who caused all the problems. Xerxes is the one that God used to bring about what would happen with the Grecian Empire. And so none of those other kings matter. The stage was set. God was finished with what he wanted to accomplish with Persia. He had used them to send Israel back home, and he had used them to stir up Greece. And so Persia did its job, and off to the dustbin of history it goes. God had supported it and protected it for a time for one reason: to accomplish his divine purpose. Then we move to verses 3 and 4, where we see that God breaks and divides as he chooses. God breaks and divides as he chooses. Look with me at verse 3. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Now there is a 150-year time gap that takes place between verse 2 and verse 3. The events that took place in that period, those events are not important to the story that God wants to reveal in this particular vision. Scholars are all in agreement that the mighty king of verse 3 is Alexander the Great of Greece. And while historians have written multitudes of works about Alexander, God gives him just one verse in this lengthy chapter. He was a powerful king who conquered the known world of his day, and he did so because he was spurred on by the way Xerxes had come in and tried to attack Greece and to conquer it, and he wanted to get revenge, and that's exactly what he did. He set his sights on defeating Persia, and he accomplished that. He was a powerful king, conquered the known world of his day. He ruled with absolute power. He truly did whatever he wanted to do. But as we've mentioned before, he died at the age of 33. Then we see verse 4, what happens. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these. And listen, that is exactly what happened. Alexander's sons were murdered, leaving absolutely no descendants of his to take the empire. So following his death, over the course of time, 4 of his generals eventually divided up his kingdom into 4 parts, as we've talked about. Cassander took Macedonia and Greece. I'm going to butcher this name. Lysimachus took Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. Ptolemy took Egypt and Israel, and Seleucus took Syria and Mesopotamia. And with the splitting of the kingdom, none of the 4 that followed Alexander ever matched the power and strength of the Grecian Empire. God plucked Alexander's kingdom up. He divided it into 4 pieces, and he gave it to others as he saw fit. And with that, Alexander the Great is finished. He served God's plan. He served God's purpose, setting up the next stages of God's plan. That brings us to these next 2 countries where we're going to spend quite a bit of time tonight. And that is Egypt and Syria. Egypt and Syria. Over the coming verses, we're going to be introduced to a lot of people from the kingdoms of Egypt and Syria. So to help you follow along, I have provided on the back of your sheet a list of the rulers for you to be able to reference. And I've tried to help you out by listing the verses where each of these rulers is referenced. So you'll see as I go through and we go through these verses, I'm going to talk about these rulers and what they did and how it applies to the verses that we're reading. And you'll see that, and you can see the time frames that they ruled and kind of how they crossed up with each other. And I know it helps to have a visual sometimes to be able to see who we are, who and where we are, okay? So that is available for your reference. And what you'll be able to do after I give you this first point in just a moment, it might be easier for you just to have your sheet turned over until we get to verse 13. But either way, I just wanted you to be aware that's on the back if you need to use that to follow. Now, as we look back on the annals of history, these two kingdoms of Egypt and Syria, they really don't ever amount to much during this particular era of time, which is about 323 to 163 BC. Instead, from a world history perspective, it is Rome who is quickly building the most significant global power as it is rising up during this time period. So Egypt and Syria, they're there, but they're not major powers. The rising major power is Rome. When we, from a historical perspective, look at history, Rome is who we focus on. So why does the Bible, and why does this vision, and why does Daniel focus on these two seemingly insignificant nations of Egypt and Syria? Well, remember what I said. Daniel's focus is all about who? It's about Israel. He's concerned about Israel and the future of Israel and what's going to happen with Israel. And this vision is a vision that concerns the future of Israel. And these two kingdoms were going to play an important role in Israel's future. One of these kingdoms was to the north. The other was to the south. Well, guess where that leaves Israel? Right smack in the middle between these two kingdoms, all right? These two kingdoms, you got Syria on the north, Egypt on the south, and these two kingdoms are going to be at war with each other for the next 175 years. And they are going to play political and military ping pong with the nation of Israel for those 175 years, all the way until Antiochus III and Antiochus IV, who we've already talked about, Antiochus Epiphanes, comes on the scene. But until then, what we see, we could describe as an ongoing civil war between the north and the south, between Syria and Egypt. And these two countries are just going to constantly be going at it, and Israel is going to be caught in the crosshairs. And that is what we find here, beginning in verse 5. Let me go ahead and give you this point. And that is this: God gives Egypt victory, but its king exalts himself. So what we're going to find is at the very beginning, verses 5 through 12 record the period of Ptolemaic or Egyptian dominance. So from verses 5 through 12, the primary dominant power between these two nations is going to be Egypt, because God gives Egypt the dominance. But at some point, the king of Egypt is going to exalt himself instead of giving God the credit, and we know how God feels about pride, right? So that's what we find in verses 5 through 12. So let's go ahead and let's just read verse 5 for now. It says, "Also, the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion." All right, so the king of the south here is a reference to Ptolemy the First, the ruler of Egypt and a former general under Alexander the Great. That reference to one of his princes, or depending on your translation, one of his commanders, is a reference to Seleucus the First Nicator, which you also see on your sheet. Seleucus was originally installed after Alexander fell. He was originally installed as a vice regent of Babylon. But he was defeated by a man named Antigonus, and he was forced to flee from Babylon, and he fled to Egypt. He found someone who was willing to take him in the person of Ptolemy I. And so Ptolemy happily received Seleucus into his kingdom. And he put him to work because Seleucus was a great military commander. And so he served under him, and it was at the Battle of Ipsus where Seleucus secured a major victory for Ptolemy. It was also there where he defeated Antigonus, finally, and he seized for himself the largest share of Alexander's empire. His kingdom, what he began to reign over, actually became the largest land area out of Alexander's empire. So that's where you see when it says, he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. That's describing what would happen for Seleucus. He would come under Ptolemy, but he would eventually break out, and he would end up having the greater of the two kingdoms, especially in relation to size. His kingdom included Babylonia, Syria, and Media, and it was the largest of all the divisions of the empire. From that point forward, conflict would continue between the kingdoms of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids for the next 175 years. And you can imagine why. I mean, here's Ptolemy. He brought Seleucus in, right? He's like, hey, you come help me. I'm going to take you in. You're fleeing for your life, and I'm going to bring you in here. And now suddenly, Seleucus breaks off, and he's got the biggest kingdom of all. So you've got this civil war that is now going to go on here, and there's conflict that just rages between the two. Well, Ptolemy I died in 285 BC, and war continued under his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who, according to tradition, is the one who commissioned the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. That is what we now call the Septuagint. Finally, Ptolemy II made a treaty of peace. Ptolemy II made a treaty of peace with the Seleucid ruler who is now Antiochus II Theos, around 250 BC. Look at verse 6 with me. And at the end of some years, they shall join forces. There will be peace. For the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand. But she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. So here's Ptolemy II. He is on the throne. He is now the king of the south. And he arranged for his daughter, Berenice, the daughter of the king of the south, to marry Antiochus, who was the king of the north. This was an effort to seal the peace agreement between these two nations. However, there's one problem. Antiochus was already a married man. He was married to a woman named Laodice. Now, part of the stipulations for this marriage was that in order for him to send Berenice to marry Antiochus, he demanded that Antiochus divorce Laodice and declare her two sons by him to be illegitimate sons. Now, Antiochus agreed. So he divorced his wife, he declared his two sons illegitimate, and Ptolemy, he bestowed a fortune upon his daughter, and he sent her off to Syria with great pomp. Both rulers thought, we have brought peace, and they did for a while. It was all going great until Ptolemy Philadelphus died. As soon as he died, Antiochus dumped Berenice, and he took Laodice back as his wife. But as many of you can imagine, Laodice was a woman scorned. And that doesn't always go over well, right? If I'm just going to tell you now, if I did something like that to my wife, first of all, she ain't never remarried me, but I'd better sleep with one eye open because she's going to do exactly what Laodice does. Laodice doesn't trust Antiochus at all. And so what does she do once they're remarried? Eager to secure the throne for her son, she poisoned Antiochus, and then she had Berenice killed as well. According to Apollinaris, most of Berenice's attendants were killed before her eyes while they were trying to protect her. And then they killed her child in front of her. Thus, Berenice fulfilled this prophecy when it says that she did not retain the power of her authority, and those who brought her perished as well. That is the sad story of Berenice. Verse 7. But from a branch of her roots, whose roots? Berenice. But from a branch of her roots, one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them, and prevail. From a branch of her roots refers to Berenice's brother, Ptolemy III, who took the throne after his father's death. So just get the picture. Ptolemy II dies. Antiochus puts Berenice away, remarries Laodice. Laodice kills Antiochus, then kills Berenice. Ptolemy III hears about how his dear sister has just been murdered, and he's got revenge in mind. And that's exactly what he does. In retaliation for his sister's murder, Ptolemy III attacks Syria with a great army. That war lasted from 246 to 241 BC. Ptolemy captured and looted the Seleucid capital of Antioch, which is the fortress of the king of the north, as we read in verse 7. And look at what the vision says he'll do after conquering the fortress of the north. Verse 8. And he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt, with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Ptolemy did just that. He seized the gods of Syria along with other valuables, and he took them back to Egypt. Verse 9. Also, the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. We're given little information about this next event, other than the king of the north attempted to make a strike at the south, and he failed and returned back home. But verse 10, however, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. The Syrian king Seleucus II died in 226 BC. But his sons, Seleucus III and Antiochus III, continued the conflicts with the Ptolemies. Seleucus III was murdered after a short 3-year reign, and his brother Antiochus III came to power. Antiochus III was called Antiochus the Great because of his military successes, which included his campaigns in Phoenicia and Palestine, which were both parts of the Ptolemaic Empire. It also included his campaigns at one of the south's fortresses. Then verse 11, and the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude. But the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. So in response, the king of the south, who is now Ptolemy IV, was filled with rage and launched a counterattack. Ptolemy would win a great victory over Antiochus and the Syrians at Raphia in Palestine in 217 BC. But notice what happens because of his victory over the north. Verse 12. When he has taken away the multitude that the king of the north had come with, when he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. Pride fills his heart, And the Egyptian army, it slaughtered tens of thousands of the Syrian troops in the battle. But the Ptolemaic triumph would not last. The text in verse 11 implies something important. It says that God gave the king of the south, it gave Egypt its victories. Notice what it had said. The multitude that the king of the north came with, he musters a great multitude. That multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. Well, who gave it to them? God did. It was God who gave the north's army into the hands of the king of the south. However, as we humans are so tempted to do, the Egyptian king became arrogant, and his heart was exalted, and he became proud. And we all know how God deals with the pride. And so that is going to spell a switch. The south is now going to cease from being the more dominant side, and now we're going to see Syria become the greater of the two. And that's where we look at this next major point. God gives Syria victory, but its king was willful and insolent. The verses suddenly switch their focus between verse 12 and verse 13. The dominant nation has primarily been the Ptolemies in Egypt, but now the Seleucid supremacy is going to become the focus. Approximately 15 years after the Egyptians slaughtered the Syrians, Antiochus III again invades Ptolemaic territories, and this time he does so with a huge army. Look at verse 13. For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. Well, what spurred Antiochus III to suddenly attack Egypt after 15 years? Well, the reason was because Ptolemy IV died in 203 BC. And the person who was crowned king was his 4 to 6 year old son, Ptolemy V. So for Antiochus, this was the perfect time to strike, right? You got a 4 to 6 year old on the throne. Let's do it now. And that's exactly what happened. But it would not just be the king of the north coming at the south. Instead, he was going to be aided by Philip V of Macedon. He was going to be aided by revolutionaries in Egypt who would rise up as well. Then notice verse 14. Now in those times, many shall rise up against the king of the south. That's a reference to Philip V and revolutionaries in Egypt. But notice what it says next. Also, violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. So in this conflict, Antiochus would also be aided by violent men of your people. Well, who is the angel talking to? He's talking to Daniel. So who are your people? Israelites, Jews. So it says, listen, Jews are going to come to Antiochus III's aid. It says they're going to do this in fulfillment of this vision. Now, it may not be their intention to fulfill the vision, but that was the result. And they fail in their attempt at the hands of the Egyptian general Scopas, who was eventually defeated. Antiochus III, Syrian forces, though, they advanced against Egypt at the Battle of Panium in 199 BC, and they won a resounding victory. Notice verse 15. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. Listen, they pursued the Egyptians south. They captured Sidon, a fortified city where General Scopas finally surrendered in 198. The south, at this point, had suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the north. And with the defeat of the Egyptians at Sidon, Antiochus acquired complete control over both Phoenicia and Palestine, and he had the ability to do in those areas whatever he willed to do. Verse 16. But he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land," that's a reference to Israel, "with destruction in his power." Listen, no one would be able to stand against Antiochus III. From this point forward, Palestine came under his complete control. That phrase, "with destruction in his power," it emphasizes Antiochus III's complete power over the land of Israel. He could do whatever he wanted to do to them because they were under his dominant power. That is important because it sets the stage for the reign of terror that would follow under the Syrian Greek ruler that we've already referenced before, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Well, with this victory in Sidon and this moment where he has gained control of Phoenicia and Palestine, the Syrians then went about forcing terms of peace on the Egyptian king. Notice verse 17. "He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but she shall not stand with him or be for him." All right, so what's this all about? Well, he's looking to set a little bit of peace. He's really trying to force his way into complete control of Egypt. And in order to do this, he comes up with this clever peace treaty that he thinks is going to work. Antiochus decides to give his daughter, Cleopatra, to Ptolemy V as a wife. Now, this is a different Cleopatra than the Cleopatra we know of Mark Antony Cleopatra fame, okay? This is the first of what will be many Cleopatras in Egypt, okay? But Antiochus had hoped that through his daughter, he would gain control over Egypt. He thought, if I can just marry her off to Ptolemy, I can rule Egypt through her. One problem, his plan failed because his daughter fell in love with Ptolemy. And she decided, after falling in love with Ptolemy, she decided to support the Egyptian cause instead of daddy's cause. So his whole plan fell through. The next two verses prophesy about Antiochus' defeat and his disgraceful end, verse 18 and 19. "After this he shall turn his face to the coastlands, and shall take many, but a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end, and with the reproach removed he shall turn back on him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found." So, having defeated the Egyptians in 197 BC, or shortly thereafter, Antiochus turns his attention to the coastlands. That is a reference to the countries around the Mediterranean Sea. And after he had some initial success, a man named Lucius Cornelius Scipio was sent against him by the Roman government. This is the ruler who shall, according to these verses, shall bring the reproach against them to an end, and with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. The NIV says it this way. It says he will put an end to his taunting. Instead, he will turn his taunts against him. That was what Scipio did when he came and confronted Antiochus III at the coastlands. In 191 BC, the Romans, fighting with the Greek allies, routed the Syrians at Thermopylae and forced them to withdraw from Greece and flee back to Asia Minor. With only 30,000 Roman troops, they pursued Antiochus into Asia and defeated his much larger army of 70,000 men at the Battle of Magnesia near Smyrna in 190 BC. So this Roman commander with 30,000 troops beat back the Syrians all the way back to Syria and then defeated their 70,000 man army at the Battle of Magnesia. You can imagine that was a humiliating defeat for Antiochus III. And after that defeat, Antiochus returned to his country where just a couple years later he was killed by an angry mob in 187 BC as he tried to pillage the temple of Zeus so that he could pay tribute that he owed to Rome. Antiochus rose to great power. He did great things, but he stumbled and fell very quickly. The son and successor of Antiochus III was Seleucus IV, who then, when he took the throne, sent a tax collector named Heliodorus to collect money to pay the 1,000-talent indemnity demanded every year by Rome as part of the settlement for Syria's surrender to Rome. Look at verse 20. There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. Seleucus IV reigned only a few years, and he was not killed by an angry mob in anger like his father, and he was not killed in battle. Heliodorus, his tax collector and prime minister, evidently seeking to gain the throne for himself, poisoned the king. There are some who speculate that he was aided by Antiochus IV, but we don't know that to be true. But he poisoned the king, and that set the stage for the Antichrist figure of Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, in verses 21 through 35. History has unfolded just as God said it would. Kingdoms and their despots, they come and they go. They live and they die. They win and they lose. And our great God in heaven, as Psalm 2:4 says, watches it all and laughs. This is, I will say, this is an unusual and unique passage to be sure. God is never mentioned in these verses, is he? He's never been mentioned by name, and there's a lot of unfamiliar imagery for us to grasp. So what can we take from it? I believe by asking some basic theological and practical questions, it can help us get at what God wants us to understand from this portion of the Bible that he inspired. So the first question we should ask is this: what does this text teach us about God? The first thing that we see as an answer to this question is this: our God is sovereign and omniscient. This text clearly teaches us that our God is sovereign and omniscient, knowing the future to the smallest detail. Listen, he can predict the future with pinpoint accuracy. Back in Daniel chapter 4, verse 17, we were taught the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms. He gives them to anyone he wants and sets the lowliest of people over them. He is the one who is breaking and dividing and uprooting in chapter 11, verse 4. These earthly rulers, they were merely pawns in the sovereign hands of an omnipotent and providential God. So when I read these verses and I see the detail that is given here, listen, to be able to pinpoint and to be able to say what was going to happen with Berenice and what was going to happen with Cleopatra, and to be able to give all these details of what would happen with each of these kings, listen, only God can do that. Only he can. He was sovereign and omniscient, and as such, he is able to reveal all as he does. So listen, when I worry about what's going on right now, why should I worry when the sovereign, omniscient God is the same God that's in control today that was in control then? Okay? So there's one thing we can take from this. The second question we can ask is, what does this text teach us about fallen humanity? I believe it's this: man in his depravity, in his pride, and in his sin has a bloodlust for power and possessions. That's what depravity, pride, and sin does. It produces a bloodlust. Mankind fights and wars and does whatever he wants if he can. Might makes right. Right? Isn't that kind of the big statement? Man exalts his heart Man, it inflates his sense of self-worth. And given the opportunity, mankind will absolutely trample over other people to get what they want. So don't look around in this world and tell me that's not true. You can see it everywhere. You can see it not just with kings. You can go to the workplace and see it, can't you? I've worked with plenty of people. They have no problem hurting you, trampling you, stomping on you if it gets them what they want at work, if it gets them where they want to be. Listen, that is what man's depravity does. That is the story of human history since the fall. And it will continue to be our legacy until the return of God's King and the inauguration of his kingdom. Lastly, what does God want me to do? I think this one's fairly simple. Learn from the mistakes and sins of men and women from the past. Learn from these people who pursued earthly gain instead of heavenly reward. Avoid the pitfalls of pride and greed. Instead, pursue Christ and his traits of humility, generosity, and service. Listen, you won't act, look, or live like the kings of Daniel 11. Instead, you'll choose to begin to look and live more and more like the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's what we need to do. Learn from these people and their mistakes of not following God and trying to live and honor God. And instead, let's be a people who choose to live and honor God in our lives. All right? That's where we finish tonight. Next week, we'll pick back up in verse 21, and we will go all the way through verse 35, 21 through 35. All right? Thank you for coming.